So I think we're going to get started. We usually don't have a microphone, so this is super exciting and good. So welcome to the Faculty Author Series. I'm really glad you're all here with us today. And my name's Elizabeth Penko, and I'm a librarian here at UC Merced. I'm really pleased today to be able to introduce Dr. Tanya Golash-Boza, who is going to be giving our Library Faculty Author Series talk for today. The Faculty Author Series showcases the latest research and scholarship by UC Merced faculty members. And if you'd like to be featured in a future Faculty Author Series talk, please let me know. We would love that. For today, we're really thrilled to have Dr. Golash-Boza here with us. Dr. Golash-Boza is the Executive Director of the University of California, Washington Center and a Professor of Sociology at UC Merced. Dr. Golash-Boza is the founder of the Racism, Capitalism, and the Law Lab, and before coming to UC Merced, she was an assistant professor of sociology and American studies at the University of Kansas. Dr. Golash-Boza has published numerous books and dozens of academic articles and book chapters. She also received the UC Merced Senate Award of Excellence in Faculty Mentorship in 2019. She holds a BA in philosophy from the University of Maryland, College Park, a certificate of anthropology from l'École d'Anthropologie in Paris, and a PhD in sociology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And we're so glad to have us here with us today. And I'm going to turn this over now to Dr. Golash-Boza.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Elizabeth, and thank you for the invitation. It's great to be back in Merced. I have taught here at Merced since 2012, but just over a year ago, moved to DC to run the UC-DC program. So do you have any questions about that? Let me know. We'd love to have more Merced students at UC-DC. So today I'm going to give a talk based on my book, Before Gentrification, the Creation of DC's Racial Wealth Gap. So white people in the United States have, on average, 8 times the wealth of Black people. Wealth is important because it can be used to create opportunities, maintain financial security, and pass along a legacy to the next generation. This is particularly the case in the United States, where an unexpected medical bill can put you in lifelong debt, and it's nearly impossible to send your children to university without significant wealth unless you want to put them in lifelong debt. People who study wealth inequality in the United States focus on home ownership because inequality in home equity accounts for most of the racial wealth gap. White people have more wealth than Black people, mostly because their homes are worth more money and they're more likely to own homes. There's a significant racial home ownership gap in the United States. Less than half of Black people own the home where they live, as compared to 3/4 of white people. Now, activists have long fought to narrow the racial home ownership gap because of its relationship to the racial wealth gap. It seems logical that we can narrow the racial wealth gap by promoting Black home ownership. But is this true? So I'm going to answer this question today through a discussion of how home ownership has created wealth in white communities, whereas Black communities in Washington, D.C. have been subjected to disinvestment, carceral investment, and gentrification. What I'm going to share with you today is based on a larger project focused on Washington, D.C. that includes a broad range of primary and secondary sources. I'm not going to go into detail about the data and methods today, but if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer those. So one thing to note is that in today's talk, I'm going to talk about 4 neighborhoods, all of these neighborhoods in Washington, D.C., and all of these neighborhoods were nearly all white until the 1950s. But they have all changed in different ways since. So Chevy Chase, which is west of the park, has stayed primarily white and upper middle class. Mount Pleasant became integrated, but has stayed mostly working and middle class. Petworth became over 90% Black, yet stayed mostly working and middle class. And Anacostia became over 90% Black and mostly low income. So these neighborhoods were all developed with the intention of housing white residents. So when they were built in the 1940s, they were built explicitly for white people. But they've all changed in different ways since they were initially built. So first, let's take a look at why white home ownership in the United States has led to white wealth. The assumption that home ownership will lead to wealth accumulation is based on the experiences of white homeowners. For white people, home ownership translated into intergenerational wealth because their homes have consistently increased in value. White people benefited from federally subsidized home ownership programs created in the aftermath of the Great Depression that enabled them to get favorable terms on their mortgages. Basically, the amount of home equity you have is closely tied to your interest rate because you'll pay off your loan quicker if you have a low interest rate, so that leads to more equity. White neighborhoods featured well-funded schools, and school quality is highly correlated with home values. This combination of government funding and community assets has allowed white people's homes to increase in value. So let's go a little bit deeper into federally subsidized loans. Between 1933 and 1978, federal government subsidies enabled over 35 million families in the United States to purchase homes. As a direct consequence of federal policies, homeownership became the primary vehicle for wealth accumulation. By the early 21st century, 60% of middle-class American assets were in the form of home equity. These families will pass on trillions of dollars of wealth to their children through accumulated home equity. The federal policies that encouraged home ownership primarily benefited white people. One example of a federal policy that primarily benefited white people is when the Federal Housing Administration underwrote mortgages to make it easier for families to secure mortgages. However, only 2% of mortgages underwritten by the Federal Housing Administration between 1945 and 1959 went to Black families. This is because the FHA designated Black neighborhoods as high risk. Since the FHA did not underwrite loans in Black neighborhoods, banks denied loans in areas where Black people lived. And this practice is called redlining because the federal government created color-coded maps which shaded red those areas where Black people lived. In DC, redlining meant the Federal Housing Administration insured 5 times as many mortgages in the primarily white suburbs as it did in the majority Black city. Within DC, nearly all FHA subsidized mortgages went to the upper northwestern areas of the city, which were nearly all white. Today, the federal government no longer creates maps that deem majority Black neighborhoods as high risk for mortgages, but banks' discriminatory practices continue. And so in the late 20th century, one study found that only 3% of the mortgages made by the Chevy Chase Federal Savings Bank in DC between 1976 and 1992 were in neighborhoods that were not white. And an employee told a researcher that they were explicitly told not to issue mortgages south of Calvert Street or east of Connecticut Avenue. Basically, they were told not to issue mortgages in neighborhoods that were majority the majority Black. So redlining continued in Washington, D.C. throughout the second half of the 20th century in all of the neighborhoods that were majority Black. So redlining made it more difficult for African Americans to secure home loans and therefore to build wealth through home equity. Redlining also meant that when Black people secured home loans, the interest rates were often higher, meaning they would pay more for their homes over the course of the loan. Redlining also made it difficult for Black businesses to secure loans, which meant that Black people in Black neighborhoods had fewer businesses. This lack of neighborhood amenities meant that the homes in Black neighborhoods did not increase in value as quickly as the homes in white neighborhoods. In addition to subsidizing loans in white areas, the government also invested in public amenities, including water systems, highways, and public schools in white areas. Today, I'm going to focus just on schools, just to give you a sense of the disparities. So by 1970, 99.1% of Black students in DC attended majority Black schools. It was the highest rate of segregation in the country. The small number of white students that were in the DC public school system, almost all attended schools west of the park in the majority white areas. And the greatest disparities in schooling were between schools west of the park and those schools east of the Anacostia River, where students were nearly all Black and low income. In 1971, there were 18 students per teacher west of the park as compared to 22.6 in Anacostia. Schools west of the park spent 40% more money per student than schools in Anacostia. And the test scores west of the park were 2.4 grades higher than the rest of the city. These disparities led the court to conclude in 1971 that the school system discriminated against racial and socioeconomic lines, and they ordered the DC public school system to remedy these inequities. And there are even more salient disparities between majority Black DC public schools and those in the majority white suburbs. In 1985, a group of parents issued a report comparing a school called Coolidge High, which is a majority Black high school in DC, with two schools in the majority Black and the majority white suburbs, Marshall High in Fairfax County and Rockville High in Montgomery County, and found that these majority white schools were spending nearly twice as much per pupil as the majority Black schools in DC. Despite similar enrollments, Coolidge had fewer teachers, counselors, athletic teams, and library books. Notably, the budget for athletic coaches was 8 times as high at Rockville High as it was at majority Black Coolidge High. So people in white neighborhoods benefited from federally subsidized loans, as well as public investments, which in turn increased their home equity and thus their wealth. This is because home values don't just reflect the brick and mortar of the homes, they reflect the amenities in the neighborhood. Houses in amenity-rich neighborhoods are worth more. Houses in neighborhoods with good schools are worth more. And what about Black homeowners? So Black people also purchased homes during the housing boom of the mid-20th century. There was redlining, but it did not prevent Black people from purchasing homes. So whereas only 1 in 5 Black people lived in homes they owned in 1940, by 1950, 1 in 3 did. And by 1970, over 40% of Black people in the United States lived in homes they owned. Notably, there was a greater percentage increase in Black homeownership than white homeownership each decade between 1940 and 1970. The number of Black homeowners in Washington, D.C. increased 6-fold between 1940 and 1970. And by 1970, there were nearly 45,000 Black homeowners in D.C. Despite this growth in home ownership for Black people in DC, we continue to see significant wealth inequality. In the Washington metropolitan area, white families have 81 times the wealth of Black people. So high rates of home ownership did not eliminate the racial wealth gap in Washington, DC. So let's take a close look at how Black people were able to purchase homes in DC in the 1950s. African Americans were able to purchase homes in all white neighborhoods due to a Supreme Court decision that said that racially restrictive covenants were unenforceable, and particularly with the second Supreme Court decision that ordered schools to desegregate. When the Supreme Court ordered schools to desegregate, white people began to leave the city in large numbers, and this actually opened up homeownership opportunities for Black people. So up until 1948, most houses north of Park Road in Washington, D.C. had racially restricted covenants in their deeds. These are contractual agreements that prohibit the sale or rental of properties to Black people. So when developers built these majority white neighborhoods, they put these covenants in most of the deeds of the homes. And there's a group of researchers at Prologue DC that mapped every single racial petition or covenant in DC. And as you can see, they were all over the city. And developers used these covenants to prevent African Americans from purchasing most of the homes built during the housing boom of the early to mid 20th century. So they used both deed covenants, which are actually written into the deed, and then petition covenants, which is when a group of white people would get together and say, we're going to sign a petition that none of us will sell our homes to Black people. So once these covenants were deemed legally unenforceable, Black people began to purchase homes in all white neighborhoods. One example is Dr. Clarence Hinton. When Dr. Hinton purchased his home at 13th and Farragut Streets Northwest in 1953, he was the first Black person on his block. Over the next 20 years, Dr. Hinton's block became all Black. This process is called white flight, and it happened across the city. The white population of Washington, D.C. decreased by 1/3 in a generation. White flight opened up homeownership opportunities for Black people. By 1980, there were over 50,000 Black homeowners in D.C., but this hasn't translated into intergenerational wealth. So Black homeownership, in short, did not lead to Black wealth. And one of the main reasons is that many homes in Black neighborhoods did not increase in value during the latter half of the 20th century. Simply increasing access to home ownership is unlikely to diminish the racial wealth gap because neighborhoods where Black people live have consistently experienced disinvestment, and this is what would need to change. Whereas white neighborhoods got federal subsidies and good schools, Black neighborhoods experience disinvestment. So disinvestment is when the public and private sectors stop investing in the well-being of a community. This necessarily happens after some investment has taken place. So in these neighborhoods, you had developers and city officials investing a lot of money in these neighborhoods. But once the neighborhoods became majority Black, most of these investments, public and private, stopped. So segregation allowed the state to redirect resources away from Black communities and towards white communities. Areas that were historically or had become primarily Black experienced both public and private disinvestment. Segregation facilitates racial disparities in public and private investment because decision makers can choose whether to make investments in Black or in white neighborhoods. By the 1980s, the DC public school system and DC public housing were over 90% Black. And these public goods were greatly diminished once they became majority Black. In the decades after African-American physician Dr. Clarence Hinton purchased his home, he would watch nearly all the white families on his block leave. He would simultaneously witness significant declines in the quality of the public schools. So let's just take a close look at one school, Theodore Roosevelt High School. This is the high school that serves the Petworth neighborhood, and it's the high school that Dr. Hinton's children attended. So Roosevelt High was desegregated in 1954, and it became majority Black within a few years. Now, Roosevelt High had been an excellent school prior to desegregation, and it continued to provide a first-rate education at least until the 1970s. When Bonnie Benson, daughter of Ezra Taft Benson, who was the Secretary of Agriculture, enrolled in Roosevelt High School in 1955, it was a blue ribbon school noted for high standards of scholarship and its record of sending a large percentage of students to college. Also, just keep in mind that the Secretary of Agriculture sent his child to public school, something that the city has really moved away from. President Jimmy Carter sent Amy Carter to public school in 1976, and he was the last president to do so. So again, we're seeing in general a diminishment of public goods in the United States, but particularly beginning in Black communities. So when Bonnie Benson went with her father on an official trip to Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, she took the school's yearbook with her and proudly showed off the photos of Black and white students playing together. However, each year that Bonnie Benson attended Roosevelt, more and more white students left the school. And by the time Bonnie was preparing for graduation in 1958, the school had become nearly 80% Black, and soon it would become virtually all Black. Now, Bonnie probably didn't mention to the international community that when Roosevelt integrated, they closed the swimming pool at the school. And they only opened that swimming pool about 5 years ago. So again, another clear example of the diminishment of public goods when they begin to serve African Americans. Now, as Roosevelt High became majority Black, at first, it provided an excellent education to Black students. It didn't happen immediately. It was sort of a slow process. So Dr. Hinton sent Audrey to Roosevelt in 1961, 7 years after the school was first integrated. And many of Audrey's classmates have done exceedingly well. Dr. Shirley Ann Jackson, who graduated from Roosevelt in 1964, became the first Black woman to earn a doctorate at MIT. Sharon Pratt became the mayor of DC, and Dr. Charlene Drew Jarvis became the president of Southeastern University. So these highly successful Black women all attended Roosevelt in the 1950s and 1960s. However, by 1992, Roosevelt High ranks nearly last at 16 out of 17 schools in DC for its promotion rate. 1 in 3 students who enrolled in the 9th grade at Roosevelt did not graduate from high school. In that same year, only 33 of Roosevelt's 915 students enrolled in advanced placement classes, and not one of them passed the AP exam. Roosevelt High went from being one of the best schools in the city in the 1960s to one of the worst by the 1980s. And what's interesting about the case of Roosevelt High is that the neighborhood around it really only changed in one way between 1950 and 1970, and that is the race of the neighborhood residents. It was a middle-class white neighborhood in the 1950s and became a middle-class Black neighborhood by the 1970s. But the school system did not provide a good education to Black residents by the 1970s. As white people were fleeing the city, Black people were arriving in large numbers. Thus, the city's school population grew from 100,000 to 150,000 students between 1954 and 1970. And Congress simply didn't allocate enough funds to the public school system to accommodate this growth. So in DC in the 1960s and 1970s, Congress completely controlled the budget. and Congress did not allocate enough money to the school system, and that's why we see the problems in the school system. Disinvestment meant that schools like Coolidge and Roosevelt had fewer teachers, counselors, athletic teams, and library books. Schools also had structural deficiencies, and these are this photo of Coolidge High, which is not too far from Roosevelt High, was taken in 1985. 20 years after this picture was taken, and after this group of parents had organized continuously to get better conditions, they reported in 2003 that the school still needed significant repairs. So some of the people that I interviewed for this project went to Coolidge High and directly felt the effects of disinvestment. So what I want to move into now is explain the consequences of this disinvestment. So Troy joined the football team at Coolidge High, which kept him busy. However, his coach was struggling with drug addiction, and his coach often failed to show up for practice. So Troy explained that football kept him out of trouble, but the coach's absence was demotivating. So Troy explained, when I was on the football team, by the time you go to practice, you're just trying to go home, eat, and go to sleep. There wasn't time to be outside or nothing like that. Once the coach stopped showing up, that fell apart. So when Troy found himself with large amounts of free time, after dropping off the football team, he began to sell drugs, which would lead him to spending nearly 10 years behind bars. For Troy and many other youth in the city, disinvestment in public schools meant that they turned to the streets. Troy was just one of many Black youth who became involved in selling crack cocaine. Crack cocaine stepped in to fill the gaps left wide open as both the private and public sectors abandoned the city. By 1990, half of all Black youth in DC were unemployed. By 1997, half of Black male youth were under the control of the criminal legal system. With high unemployment and failing schools, young men began to sell crack in open-air drug markets to make ends meet. And crack was lucrative, and turf wars and gun violence ensued. By 1991, Washington, D.C. had the highest homicide rate in the country. And in that same year, one of the census tracts in Petworth ranked 14th in terms of the numbers of homicides out of the 179 census tracts in the city. Nearly all the homicide victims were young Black men. The city's responses to the problems created by the violence of disinvestment was not to begin to invest in schools and communities in ways that would support them. Instead, the response was to invest in prisons and policing in ways that would punish them. In DC and across the country, the local and federal government began a war on drugs that would devastate Black communities for generations. And the war on drugs marked a significant shift in budget priorities. When DC Council Chairman David Clark presented his $2.1 billion budget to Congress in 1984, he opened with these remarks. The programmatic priorities of this budget are the priorities of our citizens: jobs, housing, education, youth, senior citizen services, programs for people in need of medical and social services, and economic developments. By the time of these comments, the departure of white residents and then of the Black middle class had shrunk the city's tax base, which left the city without the revenue it needed to attend to the needs of the remaining residents. By the end of the 1980s, the economic crisis had only deepened. Nevertheless, the city's focus had shifted firmly away from social services and towards the war on drugs. Crack took center stage, and this was clear in the city's budget hearings. In a 1989 congressional hearing on appropriations, Mayor Marion Barry referred to the war on drugs as the city's #1 priority. This was not just a verbal commitment. In that same hearing, Marion Barry explained that this prioritization meant the city had funneled more money towards law enforcement and corrections. The city redirected nearly $80 million away from the Department of Public Works, the Department of Housing and Community Development, the Department of Recreation, the Department of Employment Services, and the University of the District of Columbia, and towards law enforcement. The city's $3 billion budget for 1990 included just $20 million for drug treatment, as compared to $227 million for corrections. The city's overwhelming response to problems associated with the drug trade was to strengthen the coercive arm of the state. Instead of paying for parks and libraries, the city took the path of carceral investment. Instead of addressing the root problems of failing schools and widespread economic precarity, the city focused on the symptom, the spread of crack and its attendant violence. By 1997, fully half of young Black men in DC were under the control of the criminal legal system. Black men in DC had an incarceration rate 36 times that of white men. The rate of incarceration rose steadily from about 400 per 100,000 residents in 1978 to a peak of nearly 1,800 by 1994. And this was 4.4 times the national rate and the highest incarceration rate in the world. By the 1990s, 4,000 Black men had been murdered, public schools were failing, and the Black middle class was leaving the city. Disinvestment, followed by carceral investment, gutted Black neighborhoods and set the stage for gentrification. Let's explore how disinvestment, heavy policing, mass incarceration, and stagnant home values created the conditions for gentrification and the displacement of the Black population from DC. In 1970, Petworth was a majority Black community with half of Black families living in homes they owned. Today, the neighborhood is only 50% Black, and there are only 3,000 Black homeowners. Black people who purchased a home in Petworth in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, or 80s would not see a return on this investment for decades. The median home value in Petworth remained steady, just at the rate of inflation, for 50 years. This means that investing in a home in Petworth between 1950 and 1990 would not lead to increased wealth. The rise in home value in Petworth began in the 2000s, corresponding with the arrival of non-Black residents into the neighborhood and a decline in the number of Black homeowners. In Petworth, the two-story brick homes built for white people in the early 20th century have become attractive to white buyers again. The twin forces of gun violence and the prison system took young Black men out of the neighborhood. The mass exodus of white residents in the mid-20th century and then of Black middle-class residents in the late 20th century created the conditions for gentrification in the early 21st century. It became profitable for investors to purchase devalued houses, abandoned properties, and foreclosed homes to build new homes for new people. Disinvestment combined with low housing prices, record low interest rates, and tax incentives made Petworth attractive to investors after decades of abandonment. According to a report from the real estate company Redfin, the average gain of a home flip in Petworth was $337,000 in 2016. This was the highest possibility for profit of any neighborhood in the United States. There were two other neighborhoods in this top 10 list produced by Redfin: Brightwood and Brookland, which are neighborhoods that adjoin Petworth. The Hintons, mentioned earlier, purchased their home in 1953 for about $20,000. They lived in the neighborhood for 45 years before selling their home in 1998 for $230,000. From 1953 to 1998, $20,000 to $330,000 is just the rate of inflation. They did not make a profit after living in that home for 45 years. The people who bought the home from them sold it in 2019 for $700,000. That's a fair profit on a 20-year investment. But 5 months later, the home sold for $1.3 million, a considerable profit for these investors who had flipped the home. These investors made more money on the Hinton home in less than 6 months than the Hintons did in 45 years. When Petworth was primarily Black, it experienced disinvestment. This disinvestment worked in various ways to depopulate the neighborhood, making it an optimal site of reinvestment. The first kinds of investment that Petworth began to see was carceral investment, when we see more prisons and policing in the neighborhoods. Today, Petworth has become profitable once again, but has also become unaffordable for long-term residents. Decades of disinvestment in Black neighborhoods in DC meant that home values remained stagnant, preventing Black homeowners from accumulating wealth through home ownership. Schools in Black homeowning communities had high dropout and low college enrollment rates in the 1980s and 1990s. When we add to this equation the carceral investment these neighborhoods experienced during the war on drugs, it becomes clear how and why Black families in DC have had difficulty maintaining homeownership across generations. So an analysis drawing from theories of racial capitalism can help us to understand this process. Today, the land area that encompasses Washington, D.C. is worth billions of dollars. This value is not inherent to the land itself, but was created through a series of dispossessions and displacements. These dispossessions and displacement are what made capitalism possible. The process of capitalist accumulation began with primitive accumulation, whereby the indigenous residents were expelled and a system of exclusive property rights was imposed. This process of accumulation by dispossession began with the commodification and the privatization of land, which imbued the land with monetary value. All that to say, land doesn't have any value in and of itself. You had indigenous people living on the land, you had to kick them out and then impose a system of property rights which imbued the land with value. The value of the land was then enhanced through the labor of enslaved persons who were forced to clear trees to make way for boulevards, dig ditches which become streets, make and lay brick for houses, and quarry and transport stones to build the White House. The history of Black communities in DC is one of dispossession, displacement, and disinvestment. These processes are rooted both in racial capitalism, which is an economic system that organizes and justifies exploitation by racial classification, and in anti-Blackness, which is an antisocial logic that not only dehumanizes Black people, but also renders abject all that is associated with Blackness. It is through this objection that decision makers have implemented policies that have led to the displacement and dispossession of Black people and decades of disinvestment in Black communities. Although the labor of Black people enhance the value of the land, today the presence of Black people can lead to a devaluation of the land. As geographer Catherine McKittrick explains, places associated with Blackness often become sites of environmental, social, and infrastructural decay and geographic surveillance. Sociologist Prentice Dantzler explains that the dispossession of Black and Indigenous communities makes accumulation possible, and that their displacement renews this possibility. Majority Black spaces are devalorized, and this devalorization creates the possibility for the revalorization of these places. But for this revalorization to happen, Black people must be displaced. Dispossession becomes the antecedent for accumulation, and displacement regenerates this cycle of exploitation. The ease with which Black people have been systematically and repeatedly displaced from DC through dispossession of their land, foreclosure of their homes, policing, and the carceral system is rooted in anti-Black racism. So when I've shared this work with people in DC, I'm often asked, what can we do? How can we avoid these cycles of displacement and dispossession? My response to those questions is twofold. On the one hand, we can support affordable housing programs and inclusionary zoning programs that allow people to build intergenerational wealth through home ownership. The expansion of these kinds of programs would definitely help a lot of people. We can also reinvest in Black communities in ways that do not lead to the displacement of Black residents. When I interviewed people to ask them about their thoughts on gentrification, most of them were not opposed to the new amenities. Their primary objection was to being displaced from the neighborhoods, especially now, like, oh, now it's nice and now you can't stay here. But at the same time, the more that I think about the history and present day of housing in Washington, D.C., it becomes increasingly clear that these remedial solutions can only go so far. As the United States has moved away from public housing and left nearly all housing solutions to the private market, we've created a situation where one of our most fundamental human rights, the right to shelter, has been left to market forces. The only real solution lies in the decommodification of housing, like taking housing out of the market. A real solution requires a reimagining of, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore has put it, everything. We've created a racialized economic system where, to the extent that middle-class people have any wealth at all, that wealth lies in the value of their home. Yet the simple fact of a home, and particularly a neighborhood being occupied by Black people, decreases the value of that home. The barriers to wealth accumulation for Black people are not a bug in the system of racial capitalism, but a feature. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we have some time for questions.
Thank you so much. I think we have some time for questions. So, looking around.
Yeah.
So I have one. So I know you talked about redlining, which is a policy that was very active in the 1950s. So I know in the Bay Area, redlining had a legacy lasting well into the 1980s. So I imagine that redlining in DC happened much further and affected the housing situation than when its official end. So can you speak about, I think, how the continued legacy of redlining affects, I guess, DC today?
Yeah. So, and it's interesting. There's been like renewed interest in redlining, and a lot of authors have started using the redlining maps and in order to kind of predict outcomes for neighborhoods today. But what I think is really interesting when you look close at it is redlining maps are simply you could look at redlining maps. You also could just look at the population in 1940. So any neighborhood that had Black people at all would have been redlined. So it was codified into these maps, which I think is really powerful because you see like this map made by a federal agency that specifically says, do not issue loans in these neighborhoods. We will not underwrite loans in these neighborhoods. So the federal government was underwriting loans in other neighborhoods, but not in neighborhoods that had any significant presence of Black people. So I think those maps themselves are powerful. And then the word redlining has become powerful, like a powerful symbol of it. But those maps are literally just like 1 year, like in time. They're one point in time. And they were made between like early 1930s to late 1930s. But the maps are just like this symbol of the idea, or even like a self-fulfilling prophecy, that Black neighborhoods will not increase in value. So therefore you can't lend money to people in Black neighborhoods because the asset won't increase in value. So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So that definitely continues to this day, because racism continues to this day. So just like in DC right now, there has been a large influx of white residents into formerly all Black neighborhoods. And as those neighborhoods, it's like if you're a white person willing to live in a majority Black neighborhood, you can get a home for cheaper because you're one of few white people willing to do that. Now, if you wait until the neighborhood becomes like 80% white, now the homes are worth a lot more. So it's just one manifestation of racism. So you're going to see it anywhere. And in DC it happens, in DC, what makes DC a little bit different from other cities is that in most cities, there are low-income white neighborhoods, low-income Latino neighborhoods, low-income Black neighborhoods. So white people have choices, and they tend to first choose the low-income white neighborhood because there's still a lot of racism, and then the low-income Latino neighborhoods. White people are less averse to moving into Latino neighborhoods than Black neighborhoods. And then the low-income Black neighborhoods often don't get gentrified. But in DC, there was no low-income white neighborhoods in 1970. There was one low-income Latino neighborhood that quickly got gentrified, and then if you wanted to live in the city, you had to live in a Black neighborhood, like if you didn't have a ton of money. So it's kind of, yeah.
Thank you so much. I know that you didn't go into the methods for this, but I wanted to be open to talk about that a little bit.
So much. I know that you didn't go into the methods.
I was struck both by where you got like the interview data, but also just the breadth of archival data. I'd love to hear more about how you gather, where you gather that information, how you put it all together.
Yeah, great. Are there any graduate students in the room? No. Okay, because just because this book was very much a COVID baby, like a quarantine baby, right? So I started this project in before the pandemic started, before anyone knew what COVID was, and I was doing interviews, and I actually had a grant to conduct 75 interviews with like 3 different kinds of people, 25 in each category, and I got to about 25 interviews on my last trip to DC, and then I came back to Merced and lockdown. So I continued to do some interviews online, but it was harder to recruit. It was harder to find people for the study. So I ended up doing 37 interviews, and that became one piece of the project. But I had this grant from the National Science Foundation that allowed me to hire students, and I already had students working on undergraduate students working on the project. And then, one like interesting part of the shutdown was that the university opened up work study money to researchers. So you could hire undergraduate research assistants using, I had like federal grant dollars, but now they're going to go 3 times as far because I could hire undergraduate students with them. So then I hired like 12 undergraduate students. And I felt like, I was doing my part in the pandemic, just trying to give people jobs. And so then I had all these students, and we were able to collect a lot of, this didn't show up so much, but we did a lot of like GIS work collecting, we did this Google Street View survey. And then we did this big archival project, and they were able to like catalog all of the stuff that I would go to DC and take pictures of documents, and they could catalog it. So it kind of was like a do what you can kind of situation, but it ended up, but then I had a lot of help because I had extra resources due to the pandemic, just the way things shifted during the pandemic. So I had the 37 interviews, but then we found another 40 oral histories at the DC Public Library that we were able to listen to those oral histories, and I had the transcription. So I had students that could code those oral histories. And then when I finally was able to go back to DC, I went to an archive and took a bunch of pictures of documents from this archive. And then there was a bunch of stuff online. Like there's so much data online that you can just find if you look hard enough. So it really was just like a pivot, and then a lot of help.
Hi.
Great information. Thank you for sharing. Thank you. So I don't know if you were able to attend that Ben Crump, attorney Ben Crump came on Saturday to the Black Student Coalition. We had over like 500 Black students come, and he spoke to a time during the pandemic where people were able to refinance at a 1% rate.
Yeah.
And he says his law firm is actually going after some of the banking institutions because the rate that Black people were allowed to refinance, even through Navy, Federal, and Wells Fargo, was so low compared to that, they were able to refinance for Caucasian families. So there's a lot of research that speaks to that currently still going on, like you said.
Absolutely. And I think, that's the big thing about home equity. Like if you have a 10% mortgage, your principal is just like, you're not going to pay down the principal. So you might it's just going to take a long time to accumulate that equity. And I think, so that is a big part of the story. I was really fascinated though, to find out through, so as I was talking to people in DC, and I would ask people who had been incarcerated, I would ask them about their family history. And a lot of them would tell me that their parents owned homes and their grandparents had purchased homes. I started to try and understand how that happened. So I was able to get data, and a lot of their parents were veterans. Yeah, and a lot of their grandparents, particularly grandparents, were veterans. Like they bought homes after World War II. So a lot of people have argued that Black people were denied the VA loans, but in DC, I kept hearing about veterans getting loans, and I was wondering, was it the VA loans, which were at the time were 6%, which was the standard rate at that, in the 1940s. So I asked the VA for their loan data. There's another piece of data that I was able to get, and they gave it to me, not individually, but they gave me like the aggregate data. And that was super interesting to look at. They didn't record race there was a lot of missing data, but it was clear in the data that Black people were able to get those VA loans. So they were able to get the VA loans. They got the housing for reasonable prices, but then the homes didn't increase in value for 50 years. So it's like all these, so even when that piece worked out, that one piece, which was the loans worked out, then the other pieces didn't fall into place.
I was wondering your thoughts around the strengthening of tenant protections within like your understanding of solutions, and then also if within your interviews, if there were any interviews that focused on tenants, and then just kind of a second follow-up question, like if you have any data around, how many Black homeowners are now tenants or even became homeless, and if there's any where you place the tenant rights within the conversation.
Yeah, and so interestingly, DC is interesting because we actually have relatively significant tenant protections, and we have this thing called TOPA, Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. So if you're living in a building and the owner of the building wants to sell it, they have to first offer it to the tenants of the building. The problem is that it's very complicated to make that happen, and all of the tenants have to agree, and they have to have the resources. So it happens occasionally, but there are buildings in DC that have been sold to tenants, and then some of them also then become cooperative housing. And the good thing about cooperative housing is like the rent's not going to just increase on you because because it's agreed on by a board. So cooperative housing has this benefit of housing stability. It doesn't have the benefit of wealth accumulation though, because it doesn't increase in value, which is kind of the purpose of it. But so it's interestingly, like it does help, but it doesn't really help in terms of reducing the racial wealth gap. But yeah, I didn't look specifically at tenant protections, but I do know that DC has a lot of there are significant tenant protections, and that has helped. That particularly helped during the pandemic. But yeah.
For your talk and all of this, all of the research, and for sharing it with us today. I'm curious within your thoughts about solutions, how it might actually work to remove housing from the marketplace, and whether within that process there's any sort of sense of or ability to create reparations. And I'm also just curious in general if any of the conversations you've had in DC have come around to the topic of reparations and kind of what that might look like.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when we think about the decommodification of housing, it's kind of like if you think about prison abolition. Like it's not something that's going to happen tomorrow, right? It's something that if it's a framework, if it's something that you want to work towards. So think about decommodification of housing. It's something that you could actually work on immediately, like in Merced. So student dormitories are decommodified housing, right? So when the University of California Merced is thinking about expanding the availability of housing to students, staff, and faculty, if you're involved in those conversations and you can push the university to create decommodified housing that's not on the market, right, then you're helping to preserve affordability, both for us, those of us on campus, and for people in town. But to the extent that the university begins to collaborate with investors, right, now you're putting it out on the market. And that may have some short-term gains for the university, but ultimately it's contributing to the overall problem. And I'll just say this about Merced because it's something I've thought about. Like San Francisco, if you work at Target, like you can't afford to live in San Francisco. You can't afford to live in Tracy. You can't afford to live in Stockton. So Merced is like the end of the line. Like if you work at Target in Merced and you can't afford to live here, like literally where are you going to go? Like Planada? I mean, like, okay, maybe that's the end of the line, but there's not like, from Merced, there's no escape. So from San Francisco, I mean, it's obviously very inconvenient to work at Target and have to live in Merced or Stockton or Tracy, depending on what you can afford. But Merced, that's it. Like we're really out of options. Like if a low income person can't afford to live in Merced, I mean, like why would you come here and work at Target if you can't even, like you would go live somewhere else? Anyway, so I think that's sort of in terms of decommodification, that's something you can work on here, right? Like as a resident of Merced, like thinking about ways that we can take housing out of the market and just provide it to people because they need it. Like students need housing, staff needs housing, faculty need housing. Like how do we make it available to people? And then the other part of the question was about reparations. Oh, yeah. So last year, so I work at UCDC, and although I'm not teaching there, I do have my lab still there. So every term I bring on interns, I'm to work on different projects in my lab. So last spring, a year ago, I brought on interns from different UC campuses, and we collaborated with the DC Justice Lab to provide commentary to the DC City Council on the reparations bill. So that was actually super cool because the DC council members, they know that California has a reparations bill, and they wanted to hear like what the opinions of Californians on the reparations bill. They were able to have a hearing with the DC council on the reparations bill. So the students came up with the idea of creating an eminent domain database. So there have been multiple instances in Washington, D.C. where the city or federal government expropriated the land of Black people in order to build amenities for whites, like over and over again. So, but no one has ever like collected that information into a database. So that was one idea that they came up with. And then I should have a meeting in the next couple of months with so now with the council, there's a council member in DC who has proposed the reparations bill, and he wants to expand the housing part based on that conversation with those students. So that's something we'll be in continued conversation about the DC reparations bill. Now DC, any bill that's passed in DC has to be approved by Congress. So no matter, even if it gets passed through DC, we'll have that extra hurdle of having it passed through Congress. So we'll see how that looks and when the time comes. Yeah.
Thank you very much. This is just a fascinating study, I think. I wonder, the story about this DC kind of DC wells gas, and it's interesting, and it seems to me it's a pattern for urban kind of settings in America. So I wonder if this is a reflection of other cities as well. Around DC, a lot of residents have moved out, and poor people either come in or have remained in the city. And now the Black population is over 50% in the city proper. So is it a true reflection of other cities and all in the country? The other part of it is a lot of these people that have moved out moved into suburban areas. But in DC, that's into Virginia and Maryland. So, it's kind of tricky. That would not be DC proper anymore, but in other states. So
yeah, and I think that the patterns that we see here in DC, you would find with any city that had a significant post-emancipation, that Black migration phenomenon. So any city where you saw large numbers of Black people moving in the aftermath of emancipation would have a similar trajectory in terms of the trajectory that we see in DC. Of course, DC is unique, and because it's a city, it's not part of a state, and there's all kinds of things that make it different. But I think what that means is that things are exacerbated in DC, and it's also it's kind of the fact of it being a city just makes it different and exacerbated. But you could definitely test I think any of the kind of hypotheses and sort of see, like, is there a pattern in any locality where you have like disinvestment to carceral investment to gentrification? And you can look that on the national level for sure. Oh, yeah, thank you for asking. So I grew up in the Petworth neighborhood of Washington, D.C. And when I was growing up, a lot of people that I went to high school with, that I was friends with, ended up incarcerated. And in particular, actually, and I opened the book with the story of one of my high school classmates. And so this is someone who I grew up going over to her house, and she lived in this house that her grandparents had purchased in the 1950s. And when we were in college, her brother was arrested. And when he was arrested, the federal agencies used this provision that they have that allowed them to seize the home. So they seized the home basically from the family. They alleged that he was selling drugs out of the home, even though he didn't live there anymore. So I always kind of thought about that family. We're still friends, and sort of thinking about, like, her grandfather, like, he was able to, as an African-American man, he was able to purchase a home in the 1950s. That always seemed to me like remarkable, right? Like, because it was such a difficult time. And then the fact that the home was taken, you know, from them in the 1990s, and they always, the family always talks about that home. Like it was an asset, but it's also like a place. Like they feel very connected to being from that neighborhood and from that home. So sort of think about what that does to a family. And then her brother, who was arrested, he ended up doing 23 years in prison before his case was actually overturned due to the fact that they uncovered prosecutorial misconduct, and the prosecutor was actually disbarred, which is very unusual for a federal prosecutor. So a significant prosecutorial misconduct in the case. So I also thought about, like, her brother was so smart, and so like I looked up to him as a kid. So just thinking about, like, what does it do to a city or a community when you have people who lose homes and the home is so meaningful to them, when you take out these like men that have so much potential, leadership potential, when you remove like so many of them from the community. So those are kind of the questions that I started with, like, what has it was really was like, what did the war on drugs do to the city? Like, how can we kind of assess what the war on drugs did to the city?
We worked with our GIS center librarian, and I'd be interested to hear about like what that piece of the project was with, and if you've linked with other organizations around the country also doing mapping of these things and doing mapping of these things.
Yeah. So when yes, I work with the GIS center. So trying to remember the timeline. I think I started working with the GIS center even when I was writing the grant, like even before, when I was sort of thinking about the project, and I started hiring students, like undergraduate students who had some GIS experience, because my goal was to create a story map that visually displayed some of the trends. So lucky for me, I found, like, there were two students that I found relatively early in their undergraduate careers. So then they were able to not only work with me right at the beginning, but like also develop skills, take classes, and kind of get better over time. So I have this story map, and I have no idea how to make a story map, but they completely made all of my, if you look up any of my digital materials, those were all made by students. I don't know how to do any of that stuff. So having students who could access the GIS lab itself, just be able to use the program, and then also to take classes. They mostly benefited from when they were able to like enroll in GIS classes, which there are not a lot of, so that's unfortunate. But that was a super big help to be able to create these visual materials and sort of to talk with them about how to do visualization. So the only thing I'd say is, like, I wish there were more classes. And one of my students left UC Merced, and she's now at the University of Oregon, and she has access to like way more classes there, and so she's been able to do even more. So that just sort of shows the potential, like, of what we could do if students had access to more classes. I know we don't even have like a geography department, but